words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I've talked before about the history of science writer Thomas Kuhn and the important work he did back in the middle part of the last century. In the 60s, he wrote this book that's been very influential called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he popularized the idea of a paradigm shift, of there being kind of two ways that science develops, that astronomy and biology, physics develop. Usually, they're in a normal process where they all agree on the basic model of reality and work to fill in the blanks, to answer questions that arise from time to time. But usually as inventions and experimental possibilities advance, there begin to be what he called anomalies in the model, things that just didn't fit the way they thought they would. And so there's a period where they try to adjust it. They tweak the model a little bit. They put an extra loop in the orbit of a planet, and that solves some of the problems for some time. But eventually, the model doesn't work, and it falls apart. And the scientific community moves from being in a normal phase of development to a paradigm shift. And during that time, things are open. The old ways are questioned, and lots of new possibilities are entertained. And over time, there begins to be a consensus around one of those alternate possibilities. I think that lots of things work that way, not just science. And I think at this point, it's pretty clear to me that the church itself is in a kind of paradigm shift, a time of transition that is really quite radical and is changing things in ways that they haven't been changed for maybe hundreds of years. The old model of church, the idea of success, the idea of mission, was really growth and spread and numerical advancement. It was seen to be the goal that the Christian message, the Christian faith would extend throughout the world. And with it, it also brought Western culture, which was seen as a great advance to people. This was not to be confused with colonialism, although I can sympathize with those who do confuse it, because the two went along. The conquistadors went along with the friars. The East India Company went along with the missionaries to India, and so forth. In the United States, it was very similar. Almost everybody was a Christian, and for the Episcopal Church, there was a lot of success. It had become kind of the church maybe of the elite in society, the wealthy in society. It expanded and built big churches, built seminaries, built a whole institutional structure. That was a central piece of American culture. That began to break down, as any paradigm does. It began with certain anomalies, things that the church wasn't addressing that needed to be addressed, and finally came into question as a whole. I remember in 1969 there was a special convention of the church in South Bend, Indiana, that was called to address the part the church had played in the systemic racism in our culture. In the 1970s, at Minneapolis in 1976, it was voted that women would be ordained priests, which was a significant adjustment. The new liturgy was developed and voted on in 1976 and in 1979. And then in the 1980s, ordained ministry began to be extended to the LGBT community. And there were lots of adaptations. There were also lots of defections. The church lost a lot of membership, but all churches lost membership at that time. And it's hard to tell whether the reasons had to do with the new prayer book or women's ordination or whatever, or simply cultural change, as we see fewer and fewer people being willing to commit to the faith. We're in a time of adaptation now. The presiding bishop speaks about the need for a Jesus movement rather than a colonial expansion of the church, a beloved community that would nurture its members and serve society rather than control society. Our own Bishop Lucinda speaks of growing the new church, although we don't really know what that's going to be yet. We just know there's something coming. And it's probably prudent to work on discovering new models, to open up what we think. It's a little hard because the people that are still in the church are in the church because they like the old model. But this process is really an organic one, and I believe will happen no matter what. One place this gets manifested is in the area of how churches raise funds to cover the costs of their ministry. This is the time of year when pledge drives happen and budgets are being formed, and the clergy are asked to preach on the Sermon on the Mount. But it is a time to consider this expression of our faith. And really, it's changed a lot over the same 50 years, really. It used to be that pledge drives were called the Every Member Canvas. And it was just that. Every member was visited by someone in their home and asked to commit to a pledge for the support of the church. I remember the times my father was a chair of the canvas, and it was very elaborate. The rector would choose the chair, and then the chair would choose maybe 4 or 5, 6 leaders, and they would meet and they would commit their own funds, and then they would plan the canvas and choose the canvassers, choose those who would do the visiting. And that was another rim that met together and worked on their own giving, and then went out. And usually about each canvasser visited probably 4 families, 4 homes, and they were told that to answer questions. They maybe brought literature with them, and were asked to have the pledge card filled out before they left. And if it wasn't, to make an appointment to come back and get it. That tended to begin to encourage people to pledge early so that they didn't necessarily have to do that entertainment. But it also came to seem overmuch. It didn't fit with the way things were going. It was one of the anomalies that came in. And I doubt that it happens a lot now. I remember our dining room filled with index cards with names and addresses in groups for visiting, and I don't think you see that anymore. Basically, what happened was the funding became much less elaborate and in some ways maybe more personal. The purpose of giving also may not have changed, but the way that it was presented changed. Early on in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was very much encouraged to teach about a kind of stewardship of abundance. There wasn't a lot of scarcity in terms of funding for the church in America, and so what was said was that your giving should not really be oriented for the purpose of paying for the bills. What it is really a personal spirituality of your material wealth. Proportional giving was encouraged, which was seen as taking a part of what you had, offering to the church as an acknowledgement, really as a kind of sacrament, an outward and visible sign of an understanding that all things come from God. And when we give back to God, we're giving from God's blessing, that all that we have, our wealth and our property, is given to us, and we are stewards over it rather than owners. That was an important part of the teaching, and it was a kind of spirituality. As the visiting process broke down, as the membership declined, so did the rationale for giving change in what was presented to the people that needed to give. I was away from ministry in the church for about 6 years, working in the mental health system. And during this time, there was radical change. I had gone out. I was head of the Diocesan Finance Committee when this whole idea of stewardship of abundance and a spirituality of giving was popular. By the time I came back, the finance committees, the fundraising committees were all simply saying what any particular program or effort or ministry would cost for the next year. And if people wanted to have that, they had to come up with that cost. How much was a clergy salary? How much was an organist salary? How much did you pay the youth group leader? How much for a new paint job, a new roof, any kind of expansion, the building of a labyrinth? These all were given price tags, and people were encouraged to come up and meet those costs. And I don't know if that worked or not. A stewardship of scarcity really can get the ball rolling downhill pretty quick. And if people start feeling that resources are scarce, I think they're less inclined to give than more inclined to give. We're further along in the development of that paradigm shift, where we haven't come to any conclusions. We still send out a letter asking for help because we need it. We need to certainly live through this pandemic and take care of our resources. But the issue is up in the air. It's a good time over the future years to be brainstorming about this. Are there other ways to fund church ministry? Are there other ways to spend the funds? It's all part of that paradigm shift that will settle down when it settles down. I hope that it's still a sacramental expression, because one of the essences, I think, of the Christian faith is the fact that material reality can communicate spiritual truth. This was the message of the creation. This was the message of the calling of the people of Israel. This is the message of the incarnation of Jesus. It's the message of the Eucharist. It's the message of the church. And we need to continue that and express it however we can. And one of the ways we express that is in seriously meditating on what we give financially to the church. There are other issues that are part of this shift that have to do with some area of material expression in reality of the deeper spirit that we're trying to convey, to express by our actions our experience of what is holy. Two of these areas are time and place. As far as time goes, time is made sacred in our faith tradition, certainly in the history of Judaism, and the fact that much of our story is told through history as time goes on, from Abraham to Moses to the settlement in the book of Judges and the battles against the Canaanites, etc., etc. The church as well has a sacred time. I've said a number of times before how I appreciate that the rhythm of the church year, with its seasons of fasting and feasting and normal time, its special days, special saints' days, special commemorative days, hallows time and stands against our secular calendar in a way that reminds us that the two aren't always the same. That you can't, for example, put Good Friday on the first Monday after Easter. And we have to keep emphasizing that, because the secular culture right now is the one that's overwhelming the Christian culture. The Sabbath, the day of rest, the day dedicated to God, was placed right at the beginning of the scripture in the creation story of the 7-day creation. That wasn't told as a astronomy or geology or whatever natural history kind of story. It was a way to speak about the importance of the Sabbath. On the seventh day, God rested and hallowed it, and we are called to do the same. One of the commandments given to Moses says, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy." It was around Sabbath regulations that so much Hebrew and Jewish culture was evolved. And when the Christian church evolved, that day celebration, the hallowedness of time, was shifted to Sunday, the day of the resurrection, but was kept in its fullness as a very important special celebration, special time set aside for God that was remembered and needed to be kept holy. Now that began to change too with this whole shift, with this transition. The prayer book that was adopted in 1976 and 1979 says in its catechism that presents the commandments, not really so much as commandments, but special recommendations. It says to keep the seventh day holy by and what it says is set aside regular times for worship, prayer, and the study of God's ways. It doesn't even specify the day. It's just seen as a special day set aside. And that's going from the specific to the general, which is something that we see in this process of transition and in some ways maybe even degradation of the sacred resonance we have with these practices. Bishop Lucinda refers in our Zoom conversations and in her other communications, points out that Friday is her Sabbath, which basically means don't call her on Friday, or she won't call you on Friday. But at times that really seems to make the Sabbath a kind of synonym for a day off. And I don't think that's what God meant by keep the Sabbath holy. I don't know, but that whole thing is up for change, and it's part of what we need to explore if we're exploring ways to be new church. Is our worship held on Sunday? Is it held on Saturday night? Because In Judaism, the day starts with the evening. You could rationalize it that way, or is it any time? It's a question. It's a question. The same is true of the idea of sacred place. Over this same 50 years, that specificity of worship time has opened up. The importance of where we gather has opened up as well. We've been told for quite a while that the church is not the building, it's the people. And that's true. But we meet the people, we gather the people. The people are called out of the world and into the church, which is what the word ecclesia means, called out. And buildings were seen as a place set aside, a sanctuary. The red doors were made very visible so that those who needed safety could run to them and come inside and be safe. In this paradigm shift, that sense of the specialness of sacred buildings and property tended to diminish. It was seen really, the attachment to church property was seen as a almost idolatrous expression of an edifice complex, and could become problematic. Congregations argued with each other, fought with their rectors and dioceses over issues involving the building that really had nothing much to do with what we were saying was the faith. Our former Bishop Mary saw emerging communities, expressions of the new church, mostly as unattached to places. She envisioned them meeting in coffee houses or in parks or other places, people's homes, as it was true in the early church. Again, it's a movement from the specific to the general, and in considering all this, whether it's changes in fundraising, changes in when we worship or how we worship or where we worship, often there's as much to be lost as to be gained. So we need to meditate and pray and think and be patient with these changes as we weigh them against each other or against all the options that might emerge. What part does this church building play to our identity? What part does McGowan House play, or our Labyrinth, our Stations of the Cross, our Tory Gate up at High Street? What changes if we didn't have this place? Would we lose the spirit of those who came before in this place? We meet today on Zoom. What place is this? A lot of these are important questions, and they're all surrounding this kind of sacramental issue. So, along with considering your pledge for support, begin to consider how all this is moving, how you feel about time and place with respect to your faith and spiritual practice. The time of transition, the time of paradigm shift is a time of many questions. And those questions need to be asked, need to be entertained. But with prayer and God's help, I believe that in this process of change, the right response will be discerned. Thanks be to God.